2061 Odyssey 3, Chapter 1, Part 6, The Greening of Ganymede. Rolf Vanderberg was the right man, in the right place, at the right time. No other combination would have worked, which, of course, is how much of history is made. He was the right man because he was a second generation Afrikaner refugee and a trained geologist. Both factors were equally important. He was in the right place because that had to be the largest of the Jovian moons. Third, outward in the sequence, Io, Europa, Ganymede, Callisto. The time was not so critical, for the information had been ticking away like a delayed action bomb in the databanks for at least a decade. Vandenberg did not encounter it until 57. Even then, it took him another year to convince himself that he was not crazy. And it was 59 before he had quietly sequestered the original records so that no one could duplicate his discovery. Only then could he safely give his full attention to the main problem: what to do next. It had all begun, as is so often the case, with an apparently trivial observation in a field that did not even concern Vandenberg directly. His job as a member of the Planetary Engineering Task Force was to survey and catalog the natural resources of Ganymede. He had little business fooling around with the forbidden satellite next door. But Europa was an enigma that no one, least of all its immediate neighbors, could ignore for long. Every 7 days it passed between Ganymede and the brilliant mini-sun that had once been Jupiter, producing eclipses which could last as long as 12 minutes. At its closest, it appeared slightly smaller than the moon as seen from Earth, but it dwindled to a mere quarter of that size when it was on the other side of its orbit. The eclipses were often spectacular. Just before it slid between Ganymede and Lucifer, Europa would become an ominous black disk, outlined with a ring of crimson fire, as the light of the new sun was refracted through the atmosphere it had helped to create. In less than half a human lifetime, Europa had been transformed. The crust of ice on the hemisphere, always facing Lucifer, had melted to form the solar system's second ocean. For a decade, it had foamed and bubbled into the vacuum above it until equilibrium had been reached. Now Europa possessed a thin but serviceable, though not to human beings, atmosphere of water vapor, hydrogen sulfide, carbon and sulfur dioxides, nitrogen, and miscellaneous rare gases. Though the somewhat misnamed night side of the satellite was still permanently frozen, an area as large as Africa now had a temperate climate, liquid water, and a few scattered islands. All this, and not much more, had been observed through telescopes in Earth orbit. By the time that the first full-scale expedition had been launched to the Galilean moons in 2028, Europa had already become veiled by a permanent mantle of clouds. Cautious radar probing revealed little but smooth ocean on one face and almost equally smooth ice on the other. Europa still maintained its reputation as the flattest piece of real estate in the solar system. 10 years later, that was no longer true. Something drastic had happened to Europa. It now possessed a solitary mountain almost as high as Everest, jutting up through the ice of the twilight zone. Presumably, some volcanic activity, like that occurring ceaselessly on neighboring Io, had thrust this mass of material skyward. The vastly increased heat flow from Lucifer could have triggered such an event, but there were problems with this observation, but there were problems with this obvious explanation. Mount Zeus was an irregular pyramid, not the usual volcanic cone, and radar scans showed none of the characteristic lava flows. Some poor quality photographs obtained through telescopes on Ganymede during a momentary break in the clouds suggested that it was made of ice, like the frozen landscape around it. Whatever the answer, the creation of Mount Zeus had been a traumatic experience for the world it dominated. For the entire crazy paving pattern of fractured ice flows over night side had changed completely. One maverick scientist had put forward the theory that Mount Zeus was a cosmic iceberg, a cometary fragment that had dropped upon Europa from space. Battered Callisto gave ample proof that such bombardments had occurred in the remote past. The theory was very unpopular on Ganymede, whose would be colonists already had sufficient problems. They had been much relieved when Vandenberg had refuted the theory convincingly. Any mass of ice that size would have shattered on impact, and even if it hadn't, Europa's gravity, modest though it was, would have quickly brought about its collapse. Radar measurements showed that though Mount Zeus was indeed steadily sinking, its overall shape remained completely unaltered. Ice was not the answer. The problem could, of course, have been settled by sending a single probe through the clouds of Europa. Unfortunately, whatever was beneath that almost permanent overcast did not encourage curiosity. All these worlds are yours, except Europa. Attempt no landing there. That last message relayed from the spaceship Discovery just before its destruction had not been forgotten, but there had been endless arguments about its interpretation. Did landings refer to robot probes or only to manned vehicles? And what about close flybys, manned or unmanned, or balloons floating in the upper atmosphere? The scientists were anxious to find out, but the general public was distinctly nervous. Any power that could detonate the mightiest planet in the solar system was not to be trifled with, and it would take centuries to explore and exploit Io, Ganymede, Callisto, and the dozens of minor satellites. Europa could wait. More than once, therefore, Vandenberg had been told not to waste his valuable time on research of no practical importance, when there was so much to be done on Ganymede. Where can we find carbon, phosphorus, nitrates for the hydroponic farms? How stable is the Barnard escarpment? Is there any danger of more mudslides in Phrygia? And so on and so forth. But he had inherited his Boer ancestors' well deserved reputation for stubbornness, even when he was working on his numerous other projects. He kept looking over his shoulder at Europa. And one day, just for a few hours, a gale from nightside cleared the skies above Mount Zeus. Part 7, Transit. I too take leave of all I ever had. From what depths of memory had that line come swimming up to the surface? Haywood Floyd closed his eyes and tried to focus on the past. It was certainly from a poem, and he had hardly read a line of poetry since leaving college, and little enough then, except during a short English appreciation seminar. With no further clues, it might take the station computer quite a while, perhaps as much as 10 minutes, to locate the line in the whole body of English literature, but that would be cheating, not to mention expensive, and Floyd preferred to accept the intellectual challenge. A war poem, of course, but which war? There had been so many in the 20th century. He was still searching through the mental mists when his guests arrived, moving with the effortless slow motion grace of long-time one-sixth gravity residents. The Society of Pasteur was strongly influenced by what had been christened centrifugal stratification. Some people never left the zero G of the hub, while those who hoped one day to return to Earth preferred the almost normal weight regime out on the rim of the huge, slowly revolving disk. George and Jerry were now Floyd's oldest and closest friends, which was surprising, because they had so few obvious points in common. Looking back on his own somewhat checkered emotional career, 2 marriages, 3 formal contracts, 2 informal ones, 3 children. He often envied the long term stability of their relationship, apparently quite unaffected by the nephews from Earth or Moon who visited them from time to time. Haven't you ever thought of divorce? He had once asked them teasingly. As usual, George, whose acrobatic yet profoundly serious conducting had been largely responsible for the comeback of the classical orchestra, was at no loss for words. Divorce? Never, was his swift reply, walking out the door often. Of course, he'd never get away with it, Jerry had retorted. Sebastian would spill the beans. Sebastian was a beautiful and talkative parrot that the couple had imported after a long battle with the hospital authorities. He could not only talk, but could reproduce the opening bars of the Sibelius violin concerto, with which Jerry, considerably helped by Antonio Stradivari, had made his reputation half a century ago. Now the time had come to say goodbye to George, Jerry, and Sebastian, perhaps only for a few weeks, perhaps forever. Floyd had already made all his other farewells in a round of parties that had gravely depleted the station's wine cellar, and could think of nothing he had left undone. Archie, his early model, but still perfectly serviceable ComSec, had been programmed to handle all incoming messages, either by sending out appropriate replies or by routing routing anything urgent and personal to him aboard Universe. It would be strange, after all these years, not to be able to talk to anyone he wished. Though in compensation, he could also avoid unwanted callers. After a few days into the voyage, the ship would be far enough from Earth to make real time conversation impossible, and all communication would have to be by recorded voice or teletext. We thought you were our friend, complained George. It was a dirty trick to make us your executors, especially as you're not going to leave us anything. You may have a few surprises, Floyd grinned. Anyway, Archie will take care of all the details. I'd just like you to monitor my mail in case there's anything he doesn't understand. If he won't, neither will we. What do we know about all your scientific societies and that sort of nonsense? They can look after themselves. Please see that the cleaning staff doesn't mess things up too badly while I'm away. And if I don't come back, here are a few personal items I'd like delivered. Mostly family. Family. There were pains, as well as pleasures, in living as long as he had. It had been 63 years since Marion had died in that air crash. Now he felt a twinge of guilt because he could not even recall the grief he must have known. Or at best, it was a synthetic reconstruction, not a genuine memory. What would they have meant to each other had she still been alive? She would have been just 100 years old by now. And now the two little girls had once and now the two little girls he had once loved so much were friendly, gray-haired strangers in their late 60s, with children and grandchildren of their own. At last count, there had been 9 on that side of the family without Archie's help. He would never be able to keep track of their names, but at least they all remembered him at Christmas, through duty, if not affection. His second marriage, of course, had overlain the memories of his first, like the latter writing on a medieval palimpsest. That too had ended 50 years ago somewhere between Earth and Jupiter. Though he had hoped for a reconciliation with both wife and son, there had been time for only one brief meeting among all the welcoming ceremonies before his accident exiled him to Pesture. The meeting had not been a success, nor had the second, arranged at considerable expense and difficulty aboard the space hospital itself. Indeed, in this very room. Chris had been 20 then, and had just married. If there was one thing that united Floyd and Caroline, it was disapproval of his choice. Yet Helena had turned out remarkably well. She had been a good mother to Chris too, or Chris the second, born barely a month after the marriage. And when, like so many other young wives, she was widowed by the Copernicus disaster, she did not lose her head. There was a curious irony in the fact that both Chris the First and Second had lost their fathers to space, though in very different ways. Floyd had returned briefly to his 8-year-old son as a total stranger. Chris the Second had at least known a father for the first decade of his life before losing him forever. And where was Chris these days? Neither Caroline nor Helena, who were now the best of friends, seemed to know whether he was on Earth or in space. But that was typical. Only postcards date stamped, Clavius base, had informed his family of his first visit to the moon. Floyd's card was still taped prominently above his desk. Chris the Second had a good sense of humor and of history. He had mailed his grandfather that famous photograph of the monolith looming over the space-suited figures gathered round it in the Tycho excavation, more than half a century ago. All the others in the group were now dead, and the monolith itself was no longer on the moon. In 2006, after much controversy, it had been brought to Earth and erected, an uncanny echo of the main building in the United Nations Plaza. It had been intended to remind the human race that it was no longer alone. 5 years later, with Lucifer blazing in the sky, no such reminder was needed. Floyd's fingers were not very steady. Sometimes his right hand seemed to have a will of its own, as he unpeeled the card and slipped it into his pocket. It would be almost the only personal possession he would take when he boarded Universe. 25 days. You'll be back before we've noticed you're gone, said Jerry. And by the way, is it true that you have Dmitri on board? That little Cossack, George snorted. I conducted his second symphony back in 22. Wasn't that when the first violin threw up during the Largo? No, that was Mahler, not Mihailovich. And anyway, it was the brass, so nobody noticed, except the unlucky tuba player who sold his instrument the next day. You're making this up. Of course, but give the old rascal my love and ask him if he remembers that night we had out in Vienna. Who else have you got aboard? I've heard horrible rumors about press gangs, said Jerry thoughtfully. Greatly exaggerated, I can assure you. We've all been personally chosen by Sir Lawrence for our intelligence, wit, beauty, charisma, or other redeeming virtue. Not expendability? Well, now that you mention it, we've all had to sign a depressing legal document absolving Soong Space Lines from every conceivable liability. My copy's in that file, by the way. Any chance of us collecting on it? Asked George hopefully. No, my lawyers say it's ironclad. Song agrees to take me to Haley and back, give me food, water, air, and a room with a view. And in turn, when I get back, I'll do my best to promote future voyages, make some video appearances, write a few articles, all very reasonable for the chance of a lifetime. Oh, yes, I'll also entertain my fellow passengers and vice versa. How, Song and Dance? Well, I hope to inflict selected portions of my memoirs on a captive audience, but I don't think I'll be able to compete with the professionals. Did you know that Eva Merlin will be on board? What? How did they coax her out of that Park Avenue cell? She must be 100 and. Oops, sorry. Hey, she's 70 plus or minus 5. Forget the minus. I was just a kid when Napoleon came out. There was a long pause while each of the trio scanned his memories of that famous work. Although some critics considered her Scarlett O'Hara to be her finest role. To the general public, Eva Merlin, nee Evelyn Miles, when she was born in Cardiff, South Wales, was still identified with Josephine. Almost half a century ago, David Griffin's controversial epic had delighted the French and infuriated the British, though both sides now agree that he had occasionally allowed his artistic impulses to trifle with the historical record, notably in the spectacular final sequence of the Emperor's coronation in Westminster Abbey. That's quite a scoop for Sir Lawrence, said George thoughtfully. I think I can claim some credit for that. Her father was an astronomer. He worked for me at one time, and she's always been quite interested in science, so I made a few video calls. Heywood Floyd did not feel it necessary to add that, like a substantial fraction of the human race, he had fallen in love with Eva ever since the appearance of GWTW Mark II, Gone with the Wind Mark II, or Gone with the Wind Mark Twain. Of course, he continued, Sir Lawrence was delighted, but I had to convince him that she had more than a casual interest in astronomy. Otherwise, the voyage could be a social disaster. Which reminds me, said George, producing a small package he had been not very successfully hiding behind his back. We have a little present for you. Can I open it now? Do you think he should? Jerry wondered anxiously. In that case, I certainly will, said Floyd, untying the bright green ribbon and unwrapping the paper. Inside was a nicely framed painting. Although Floyd knew little of art, he had seen it before. Indeed, who could ever forget it? The makeshift raft tossing on the waves was crowded with half-naked castaways, some already moribund, others waving desperately at a ship on the horizon. Beneath it was the caption, "The Wrath of Medusa." Theodore Jericho, 1791 to 1824. And beneath that was the message, signed by George and Jerry, "Getting there is half the fun." "You're a pair of bastards, and I love you dearly," said Floyd, embracing them both. The attention light on Archie's keyboard was flashing briskly. It was time to go. His friends left in a silence more eloquent than words. For the last time, Haywood Floyd looked around the little room that had been his universe for almost half his life, and suddenly he remembered how that poem ended. "I have been happy. Happy, now I go."